Saddam Hussein and his sons must leave Iraq within 48 hours. Their refusal to do so will result in military conflict, commenced at a time of our choosing. And we will help you to build a new Iraq that is prosperous and free. In a free Iraq, there will be no more wars of aggression against your neighbors, no more poison factories, no more executions of dissidents, no more torture chambers and rape rooms. The tyrant will soon be gone. The day of your liberation is near.
On June 22, 2025, the United States launched strikes on 3 key sites in Iran: Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. These locations are believed to be central to Iran's nuclear weapons development. The attack was carried out by American air power and submarine forces, with bunker-busting bombs, likely GBU-57s, used to hit deep underground targets. However, many experts argue that the strikes did not destroy Iran's nuclear program entirely. They merely set it back in time. We'll leave the assessment of that operation to the analysts. In this video, we'll focus on something else. For many who follow Middle Eastern affairs or remember 1998, this attack brought back memories of Operation Desert Fox, when the United States bombed Iraq over suspicions that it was developing weapons of mass destruction. This video is not meant as a criticism of the United States. Sometimes evil must be stopped before it grows. Our goal is different: to revisit the past, examine key events, learn from mistakes, and perhaps better understand what the future may hold. Today, we'll talk about Ba'athist Iraq, a dictatorship with nuclear ambitions that is once again being mentioned in the context of Iran. Iraq is not just a country on the map of today's Middle East. It is one of the cradles of human civilization. It was here, in the valley between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, that Mesopotamia emerged. The first society in human history with writing, laws, and centralized government. These lands remember the Sumerians, who invented cuneiform script, the Akkadians, who first united city-states under a single empire, the Babylonians, who gave the world King Hammurabi and his code of laws, and the Assyrians, history's first true military superpower. Iraq is also a land of collapse and rebirth. After the ancient empires came the rise of Islam, and Baghdad became the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, the intellectual heart of the medieval world. Astronomers, mathematicians, and physicians worked here. Baghdad in the 11th century was, in many ways, the Silicon Valley of its time. But then came the Mongols. In 1258, the army of Hulagu Khan destroyed Baghdad completely. And with that attack, the Islamic Golden Age came to an end. Next came the Ottomans. From the 16th century until World War I, Iraq was part of the Ottoman Empire. After its collapse, Iraq fell under British control. From today's perspective, it was classic colonialism. London saw Iraq as a source of oil and a zone of strategic influence. In 1920, the League of Nations officially handed Iraq over to British administration. And although Iraq became a nominally independent monarchy in 1932, real power remained in the hands of the British for decades to come. After World War II, Iraq remained under the deep influence of empire. The Hashemite monarchy, installed by the British in the 1920s, remained loyal to London and allowed foreign powers to control Iraq's oil, military, and economy. For many ordinary Iraqis, this monarchy appeared as a betrayal of national interests, extravagant, corrupt, and completely disconnected from everyday life. By the 1950s, social tensions were boiling. Inequality, unemployment, repression, and the lavish lifestyle of the ruling elite had built up over years. At the same time, a new ideological wave was sweeping across the region: Arab nationalism. Its banner was carried by the Ba'ath Party, which promised Arab unity, social justice, and an end to the colonial legacy. In 1958, the Iraqi army, with support from nationalist officers, staged a coup. King Faisal II was killed, and the monarchy was abolished. According to some accounts, one of the participants in the plot was a young Saddam Hussein. At the time, he was part of an underground Ba'athist cell and helped prepare armed resistance against the regime. Though the coup was officially led by General Abd al-Karim Qasim, the aftermath paved the way for Saddam's rapid rise to power. During the 1960s, the Ba'ath Party briefly lost control but soon returned, this time with harsher rhetoric, tighter organization, and a new shadow figure preparing to take the reins: Saddam Hussein. His path to the top was shaped not just by ideology, but by terror, purges, fanatical loyalty, and the skillful use of fear. 1979 marked a turning point not just for Iraq, but for the entire Middle East. In Baghdad, a change of power. In Tehran, a revolution. At the time, Iraq's formal head of state was Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, a Ba'athist president. But over the years, he had lost control over both the party and the military. Real power had gradually shifted to his deputy, Saddam Hussein. In July 1979, following backroom pressure and internal maneuvering, al-Bakr resigned. Saddam, who had spent years building a power base within the intelligence services, immediately assumed the presidency. To cement his rule, Saddam launched a massive purge. In July 1979, during a Ba'ath Party Congress, Saddam Hussein personally read out the names of those he accused of being part of a conspiracy. One by one, party members stood up and left the hall on their own, under the watchful eyes of their comrades and the cameras. After the Congress, many were executed. Others were forced to personally sign the death sentences of their comrades. It was a message. Saddam was not just another president. He was a new kind of ruler, one who would govern through fear, not compromise. Meanwhile, a political earthquake was unfolding next door. In Iran, the Shah fled the country, and Ayatollah Khomeini, the spiritual leader of the Shia revolution, took power. Iran became the first major Islamic republic to openly declare its intention to export its revolution abroad. This deeply alarmed Saddam. Iraq had a Shia majority population, but it was ruled by a Sunni minority, especially the Ba'ath Party elite. The Islamic Revolution wasn't just a regional challenge. It was a direct ideological threat. Saddam saw in Iran not just a rival, but a hostile force that could inspire rebellion from within his own country. This mounting tension between Saddam's secular Ba'athist regime and Khomeini's theocratic rule would soon ignite one of the bloodiest wars of the 20th century. In September 1980, Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, launched a full-scale invasion of Iran. The official pretext was a territorial dispute over the Shatt al-Arab waterway, a vital river in the region. At the same time, Iran was in post-revolutionary chaos. Its army was disorganized, the officer corps purged, and the economy was in disarray. Saddam saw this as the perfect moment to strike. Iraq declared it was defending the Arab nation against Persian aggression. the invasion began with simultaneous attacks on the Iranian border province of Khuzestan, including the city of Khorramshahr. Iraq expected a swift victory, capture territory, demoralize the enemy, and trigger the collapse of the Iranian regime. But that calculation was dead wrong. Despite the chaos, Iranians rallied in the face of foreign aggression. Volunteers mobilized. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, was formed, and martyrdom became a central theme of resistance. Khorramshahr turned into a symbol of defiance. The battle for the city lasted over a month, and in Iran it was nicknamed the City of Blood. The air war became another major front. Iraq initially had the advantage and launched strikes on Iranian air bases, hoping to repeat Israel's success in the Six-Day War. But the campaign failed. Iran quickly repaired runways, and despite losses, Iranian pilots fought with bravery. Even though the US had cut ties with Tehran after the revolution, spare parts for American-made F-4 and F-5 still reached Iran through third countries. One of the most impressive operations by the Iranian Air Force during the Iran-Iraq War was the airstrike on Iraq's H-3 airbase complex, located near the Jordanian border, more than 1,000 kilometers from Iranian territory. On April 4, 1981, a group of 8 Iranian F-4 Phantom fighter jets, supported by aerial refueling aircraft and reconnaissance planes, carried out a deep raid into western Iraq and delivered precision strikes on 3 airstrips, hangars, and parked aircraft. According to estimates, up to 48 Iraqi aircraft were destroyed, including MiG-21s, MiG-23s, 2-16 bombers, Mirage F-1s, and several Soviet-made strategic bombers. The raid shocked the Iraqi command. It struck deep in the rear, in an area considered untouchable by Iranian forces. The H-3 operation demonstrated that even after the initial stages of the war, Iran was capable of launching precise and daring long-range attacks. To this day, it remains one of the most successful air operations in modern military history. By 1982, it became clear that Saddam's blitzkrieg had failed. Iraq was stuck in a trench war, and Iran was preparing a counteroffensive. In 1983, the strategic initiative in the war shifted to Iran. After heavy fighting in Khuzestan and repelling the Iraqi invasion, Tehran decided not to limit itself to defense. A new phase began. A counteroffensive aimed not only at liberating occupied territory, but also at taking the war into Iraq itself. Iran's official rhetoric changed. Now it spoke of liberating Iraqi Shias and toppling Saddam Hussein's regime. The main axis of the Iranian offensive was the south, the Basra region. It was Iraq's second-largest city, a key hub near oil fields and access to the Persian Gulf. Capturing Basra was seen by the Iranians as a decisive step toward victory. A series of major offensives began. Iranian forces, especially the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and volunteer Basij units, launched wave after wave of assaults. These operations had the hallmarks of a holy war. Troops advanced under religious slogans, often with little training or proper equipment. The conflict increasingly turned into a fanatical ideological struggle. Despite the immense pressure, Iraq held the line. Saddam threw in his most capable units, deployed chemical weapons, and used massive artillery and tank support. On both sides, the war was escalating into total war. Iran kept sacrificing manpower without regard for losses. Iraq expanded its use of chemical weapons and began seeking support from both the West and the Soviet Union. By the end of 1984, the front lines had largely stabilized. But neither Iraq nor Iran resembled what they were at the start of the conflict. Both nations had sunk into a war that grew more senseless and more brutal with each passing year. By 1984, the Iran-Iraq War had entered a new phase, prolonged, bloody, and increasingly unpredictable. After Iran's 1983 counteroffensive, the front lines had stabilized, but real peace never came. Iraq wanted revenge. Iran wanted total victory. Both sides prepared for all-out war. In early 1984, Iran launched a new wave of offensives toward Basra, Iraq's key southern city. But this time, Iraq was ready. Defensive lines had been reinforced, artillery was in position, and chemical weapons, including mustard gas and sarin, were used on a large scale for the first time. The message was clear. Iraq would no longer hold back. Between 1985 and 1986, Saddam Hussein's army slowly but steadily retook lost territory. Several operations were launched to reclaim border areas. This period also marked the rise of a notorious figure, Chemical Ali, Saddam's cousin Ali Hassan al-Majid. He led a brutal campaign in northern Iraq against the Kurds. This campaign became known as Operation Anfal. Under the pretext of fighting Iranian spies among the Kurds, the Iraqi regime carried out ethnic cleansing, mass executions, forced deportations, and chemical attacks. The most infamous atrocity was the 1988 gas bombing of the city of Halabja, which killed over 5,000 civilians. But even before that, in 1986 to 87, dozens of lesser-known chemical attacks had already taken place. It was genocide, seen by the world, but not stopped. During these same years, both sides received significant foreign support. Iran received help from Libya, Syria, North Korea, and partially from China. Iraq, on the other hand, was backed by Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Jordan, Egypt, the Soviet Union, and even NATO countries. The United States, France, and Germany, who would later condemn Iraq, were, in the 1980s, supplying Baghdad with weapons, intelligence, and financial assistance. The logic was simple. Western powers and Arab monarchies feared Iran. The Islamic Revolution terrified them. They feared it could spill into neighboring states, especially Shia regions of Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, or Kuwait. Iraq was seen not as the aggressor, but as a bulwark, a barrier to keep Iran contained and prevent its victory. By 1987, Iraq had lost its image as the initiator of a holy war, but it had become a symbol of secular authoritarianism standing against political Islam. And it was now supported by the same powers that had once condemned its dictatorship. As always, politics proved more flexible than principles. In the second half of the 1980s, the war between Iran and Iraq turned into a war of attrition, a brutal contest where each side sought to cripple the other's economy. In 1986, Iran launched a second major offensive toward Basra, this time with more success, while also expanding the so-called tanker war, targeting Iraq's oil exports and disrupting maritime traffic in the Persian Gulf. But Iraq struck back. It launched massive missile attacks on Iranian cities, bombed Iran's oil platforms, and used air power to strike targets across the Gulf. As both sides escalated, there was growing concern the war could spiral into a regional crisis and destabilize global oil markets. That's when the United States stepped in. Under the banner of protecting freedom of navigation, Washington began escorting oil tankers flying the American flag. Between 1987 and 1988, the U.S. Navy conducted Operation Earnest Will, the largest convoy operation since World War II. American warships escorted Kuwaiti tankers, shielding them from Iranian attacks. Then, in April 1988, the U.S. launched Operation Praying Mantis, a direct strike on the Iranian Navy. Several Iranian warships, patrol boats, and oil platforms were destroyed. The operation showcased overwhelming U.S. naval superiority and significantly limited Iran's capabilities in the Gulf. Under pressure from both international forces and internal exhaustion, both Iran and Iraq began searching for a way out of the war. In 1988, Iraq launched a major counteroffensive, recapturing lost territory and even pushing into Iranian soil. Iran, worn down by years of fighting, economic collapse, and growing public dissatisfaction, finally agreed to a ceasefire. On August 20, 1988, a ceasefire was declared under UN Resolution 598. But the reactions in Baghdad and Tehran were very different. In Iraq, the truce was sold as a victory. Saddam Hussein announced that Iran had failed to achieve its goals and that Iraq's army had held its ground. Baghdad celebrated, and Saddam, now presenting himself as a wartime leader, further consolidated his dictatorship. In Iran, the ceasefire was a national trauma. Ayatollah Khomeini called it more bitter than poison, but admitted the country could no longer continue fighting. The war had claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, destroyed infrastructure, and devastated the economy. And so ended one of the longest and bloodiest wars of the 20th century. No real victory, no clear resolution, just 1 million broken lives left behind. Iraq lost the war with Iran. Officially, the conflict ended in a stalemate. But if you look at the map, the consequences, and the casualties, the truth becomes obvious. Iraq started the war by invading Iranian territory and ended it by retreating with nothing to show for it but a crumbling regime still in power. Over 8 years of war, Iraq lost more than 150,000 soldiers, with another 500,000 wounded or disabled. Its economy lay in ruins. Infrastructure was destroyed. The national debt had exploded. Instead of victory or spoils, Iraq was left with only humiliation and a new reason to seek revenge. What made it worse was that much of Iraq's war funding had come from its neighbors, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait. These countries had bankrolled Saddam, viewing him as a shield against Iran. But when the war ended, they wanted their money back. Iraq owed Kuwait alone over $14 billion. Saddam expected gratitude, and instead got rejection. Even worse, Kuwait continued overproducing oil, driving down global prices. For Iraq, desperately trying to recover its economy, this was a disaster. Saddam accused Kuwait of economic sabotage and even stealing oil from Iraq's Rumaila oil field near the border. On top of the economic crisis, political tensions rose. In Baghdad, voices grew louder, claiming that Kuwait was historically part of Iraq, a territory carved off by British imperialism. And so, on the night of August 2, 1990, Iraqi forces crossed the border and, within hours, completely occupied Kuwait. The Kuwaiti army was overrun, the royal family fled, and Iraq declared Kuwait its 19th province. The global reaction was immediate. The UN Security Council condemned the invasion. The United States, the United Kingdom, France, and other allies began mobilizing their forces. At first, they acted to protect Saudi Arabia from further aggression. But soon, the mission expanded to include liberating Kuwait. The UN imposed harsh sanctions on Iraq, and American troops started arriving in the region. Saddam Hussein believed the world wouldn't dare to intervene for Kuwait. He was deeply wrong. This act of aggression triggered one of the largest military conflicts since World War II. Iraq had just entered a war that could reshape not only its own fate, but the future of the entire Middle East. In January 1991, a coalition of 35 nations, led by the United States, launched a military operation against Iraq. Over 950,000 troops were deployed to the region, including more than 500,000 Americans. This was not just another U.S. mission. It was the largest multinational military buildup since World War II. At the core of the American ground forces was the U.S. 7th Army Corps, redeployed from West Germany. Until recently, this unit had been preparing to defend Europe from a Soviet invasion. Now it was tasked with destroying Saddam's military. The Corps was led by General Frederick Franks, while overall command of the operation was held by General Norman Schwarzkopf, a Vietnam veteran known for his composure and organizational skill. The U.S. brought with it the doctrine of air-land battle, a strategy that focused less on frontal assaults and more on striking deep into enemy territory. The plan: paralyze logistics, destroy command centers and air defenses from the sky, and then encircle and crush the demoralized forces on the ground. But let's be clear, Iraq was no pushover. By 1991, the Iraqi military was the fourth largest in the world. Over 700,000 soldiers, more than 5,000 tanks, 4,000 infantry fighting vehicles, millions of landmines, hundreds of missile systems, chemical weapons, and dozens of divisions. Iraq also had a modern air force for its time, with MiG-29s and MiG-25s, and an extensive air defense network, including radar systems and early warning installations. Most importantly, it was an army hardened by 8 years of brutal war with Iran. Iraq had fortified southern Kuwait and its own border with multi-layered defenses, concrete bunkers, anti-tank trenches, minefields, and entrenched artillery. Saddam believed the coalition would break upon these defenses, just like European armies had during World War I. But the coalition brought 21st century warfare to a 20th century battlefield. And in that light, Saddam's line looked more like a relic of the past than a true shield. Operation Desert Storm began on January 17, 1991. The opening minutes of the war felt like surgical amputation. Under the cover of night, American AH-64 Apache helicopters penetrated deep into Iraqi territory and destroyed key air defense radar stations, clearing a path for massive airstrikes. Within hours, the coalition began hitting command centers, airfields, ammunition depots, SAM sites, and military bases. Iraq struck back the only way it could, launching Scud ballistic missiles at Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain. Saddam's goal was to drag Israel into the conflict, hoping to fracture the coalition, which included many Arab states. But Israel held back, under strong pressure from the United States, to preserve unity. Then came an unexpected move. Dozens of Iraqi aircraft were flown to Iran, a nation Iraq had fought in a brutal war just 2 years earlier. It was likely a desperate attempt to save the planes from certain destruction, as they had no real chance against American F-15s and F-16s. Why Iran? Perhaps Saddam hoped Tehran would keep them as guests. In reality, Iran seized the aircraft and never gave them back. Meanwhile, American tube and rocket artillery played a critical role in the air campaign, pounding trenches, supply lines, and command posts to soften the battlefield for the ground invasion. On February 24th, the ground offensive began, the legendary left hook. The U.S. 7th Corps, redeployed from Germany, swept west around Iraqi positions, breaking through the lines and striking deep into the rear. The most capable Iraqi forces, including Republican Guard divisions, handpicked to defend Saddam's regime, took the full brunt of the assault. Units like the Medina Division, which would reappear in the 2003 war, were either crushed or fled in chaos. In total, 14 divisions were destroyed or captured. This maneuver became a textbook example of modern warfare. Fast, mobile flanking, rear disruption, and encirclement of the enemy's core. Combined with airstrikes and artillery, the coalition's attack liberated Kuwait in just 100 hours, effectively eliminating Iraq's ground forces as a combat-capable army. The most horrific moment came on the highway of death, the road between Kuwait and Basra. As Iraqi troops retreated, American aircraft bombed the fleeing convoys, leaving behind hundreds of burned-out vehicles, tanks, and bodies. The imagery became a symbol of Saddam's military disaster. The operation ended on February 28th. Though Saddam Hussein remained in power, his army was shattered. It was a new kind of war, fast, high-tech, with air dominance and total control over the battlefield. The defeat in Kuwait had catastrophic consequences for Iraq. The United Nations imposed some of the harshest sanctions in history. Oil exports were nearly halted, international assets were frozen, and restrictions were placed even on the import of technical equipment and medicine. Iraq's economy, already devastated after the war with Iran, collapsed into a deep crisis. Oil was still exported, but only under the Oil for Food program, designed to cover basic humanitarian needs. In reality, prices soared, and shortages of food and medicine became the norm. Saddam used this situation as a propaganda tool. Images of starving children and sick elderly people were broadcast on Iraqi television with one clear message: this is America's fault. After the war, the United States and its allies established no-fly zones over parts of Iraq, in the north over Kurdistan, and in the south over the Shia regions. These zones were enforced by NATO aircraft, and Saddam was forbidden from using his own air force in these areas. As a result, Baghdad effectively lost control over northern Iraq. Meanwhile, UN weapons inspectors were sent into Iraq to search for and dismantle weapons of mass destruction. These inspections went on for years and often led to high tensions. Saddam played a game of cat and mouse, obstructing the inspectors, hiding facilities, or, at times, cooperating just enough to ease international pressure. The regime also faced internal uprisings. In 1991, right after the defeat in Kuwait, Shia rebels in the south and Kurdish fighters in the north launched revolts. Entire cities were taken over, and some army units even switched sides. At first, the US and its allies seemed to encourage the uprisings, but ultimately, they did not intervene. Saddam crushed both rebellions with brutal force. By some estimates, over 100,000 people were killed. This left a lasting scar. and created deep distrust between Iraq's minority communities and the West. Between 1991 and 2003, Iraq became an isolated, weakened, but not defeated state. Saddam's regime survived and even strengthened its grip inside the country. But internationally, Iraq became a pariah, a toxic outcast in global politics. And this was just the calm before the next storm. After 7 years of sanctions, inspections, and constant tension, Washington finally lost its patience in December 1998. Throughout the 1990s, Saddam Hussein repeatedly violated agreements with the United Nations, restricting access to inspectors, accusing them of espionage, and at times even issuing direct threats. In November 1998, things reached a breaking point. Saddam announced he was ending cooperation with the UN and expelling all inspectors from Iraqi territory. That became the official reason for the American response. Around the same time, American media reported multiple incidents of Iraqi air defenses firing on coalition aircraft patrolling the no-fly zones. None of the planes were shot down, but it added fuel to the fire. On December 16, 1998, the United States and the United Kingdom launched Operation Desert Fox. For 4 days, cruise missiles and airstrikes targeted Iraq's military-industrial infrastructure, air defenses, command centers, and, according to the Pentagon, facilities linked to weapons of mass destruction. Over 400 cruise missiles were launched, most of them Tomahawks. Dozens of targets across Iraq were struck. Importantly, the operation was short, less than a week, and involved no ground forces. The outcome? Limited, at best. Some facilities were destroyed, some systems disabled. But Saddam's regime remained in power. In fact, in the eyes of many across the global South, Saddam's image as a defiant leader standing up to imperialism was reinforced. Meanwhile, the United States was once again seen as the aggressor, bombing a sovereign country without UN Security Council authorization. This is the operation we began this video with. And today, in 2025, it's giving many observers déjà vu. Because the recent strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities carry a familiar context. A long history of sanctions, expelled inspectors, rising nuclear tensions, and a brief targeted air campaign. It feels like we're once again standing at a historical crossroads. Not in Iraq this time, but in Iran. And the question now is, what comes next? After Operation Desert Fox, the Clinton administration refrained from escalating the confrontation with Iraq. First, by the late 1990s, the United States was heavily involved in the conflict in Yugoslavia, and Washington wasn't eager to open a second front. Second, President Clinton was nearing the end of his term, and his political influence had been severely weakened by domestic scandals, especially the Monica Lewinsky affair and the impeachment process. A new major war was simply not on the table. But in 2000, George Walker Bush came to power. And just 1 year later, the geopolitical landscape changed forever. On September 11th, 2001, 2 planes crashed into the World Trade Center in New York. Another hit the Pentagon, and a 4th went down in a field in Pennsylvania. A total of 2,977 people were killed, and over 25,000 were injured. It was the deadliest terrorist attack in world history. Fear, panic, and anger became the emotional backdrop for a drastic shift in American foreign policy. The U.S. responded by launching a war in Afghanistan against the Taliban, who were sheltering Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda. But soon, the Bush administration turned its attention to Iraq. Accusations began to surface that Saddam Hussein's regime possessed weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, and possibly even nuclear. There was no solid evidence, but the US government insisted the threat was real. The most iconic moment of this campaign came in February 2003, when Secretary of State Colin Powell addressed the United Nations Security Council, holding up a vial said to contain a sample of Iraqi biological weapons. Powell would later call that speech the biggest mistake of his life. But at the time, it solidified Iraq's image in the eyes of many global leaders as a threat to world security. Beyond the claims about weapons of mass destruction, the Bush administration also alleged ties between Saddam and al-Qaeda, even though the evidence was highly questionable. Still, in a post-9/11 world where the public was traumatized and desperate for safety, the narrative gained traction. By 2002, the US had begun mass deployments to the Persian Gulf, especially to Kuwait. The operation had not yet been officially announced, but the writing was on the wall. War with Iraq was no longer a possibility. It was a matter of time. And this time, the goal wasn't just airstrikes. This time, the goal was regime change. By 2002, the Iraqi army was no longer the force it had been in 1991. 12 years of sanctions, an arms embargo, a mass exodus of officers, fuel shortages, lack of modernization, and little to no training had led to the gradual decline of Iraq's military. On paper, the army still counted around 350,000 troops, including the elite Republican Guard, the backbone of Saddam's regime. Iraq had between 2,000 and 2,200 tanks, mostly T-72s, thousands of infantry fighting vehicles, Soviet-designed air defense systems, and a fleet of MiG-29s, MiG-25s, Su-24s, and Su-25s. But nearly all of this equipment was outdated, and the Air Force was barely operational. The biggest loss, however, wasn't firepower. It was morale, discipline, and training. The officer corps had become stacked with Saddam's relatives and loyalists, appointed not for merit, but for their connections. Many of them didn't fear the dictatorship. They were part of it. Their priority was personal wealth, not national defense. Training standards collapsed, maintenance declined, and spare parts were so scarce that much of the Army's hardware had already become scrap metal before the first shot was fired. On the other side stood the coalition led by the United States. It included the United Kingdom, Australia, Poland, Spain, Italy, Denmark, South Korea, the Netherlands, Hungary, and several others. Some of these countries joined after the invasion began, but Washington and London had no shortage of allies. The US deployed around 200,000 troops to the region, including the 3rd Infantry Division, the 101st Airborne Division, the 1st Marine Division, the 4th Infantry Division, and the 173rd Airborne Brigade. They were supported by Marine Corps units, naval strike groups, Air Force squadrons, and several submarines. Their arsenal included next-generation precision weapons, from cruise missiles to smart bombs, capable of destroying targets without massive ground assaults. The British contribution included around 45,000 troops, primarily assigned to operations in southern Iraq. Despite Iraq's numerical strength on paper, the actual balance of power overwhelmingly favored the coalition. Superior air power, cutting-edge technology, real-time intelligence, secure communications, high-precision strikes, and better morale. All of it gave the US and its allies a clear advantage before the war even began. Iraq may have prepared for defense, but its military, both morally and technically, had already lost a war that hadn't started yet. On the evening of March 19, 2003, President George Bush addressed the nation. In his speech, he announced the beginning of a military operation against Iraq, aimed at removing Saddam Hussein's regime and eliminating the threat of weapons of mass destruction. This speech marked the official start of the invasion. The next day, March 20th, the air campaign called Shock and Awe began. According to American strategists, the goal was to break Iraq's will to fight through a rapid and overwhelming display of precision strikes against command centers, defense infrastructure, and key military targets. The skies over Baghdad lit up with hundreds of cruise missiles and bombing runs that continued around the clock. The goal was not only military, but psychological, to paralyze the enemy before ground combat even began. In the early hours of March 20th, the US launched a pinpoint airstrike on Dora Farms, a compound in southern Baghdad where Saddam Hussein and his sons were believed to be hiding. F-117 bombers and Tomahawk missiles were used in this so-called decapitation strike, an attempt to eliminate the leadership and end the war before it started. But Saddam survived, and the plan for a quick war fell apart. Meanwhile, American special forces were already operating inside Iraq. One of their key missions was in the city of Al-Qaim, near the Syrian border. Intelligence suggested that a chemical plant there could be tied to Iraq's weapons of mass destruction program. US troops secured the site before the main invasion began. No chemical weapons were found, but it marked one of the first direct clashes of the war and showed that America was striking preemptively. At the same time, British forces began the siege of Basra, Iraq's second-largest city. The city was defended by the Republican Guard, but after days of urban fighting, it was surrounded and cleared. Next on the road to Baghdad was Nasiriyah, a key city on the main highway north. Fierce fighting broke out over its bridges, killing dozens of American and hundreds of Iraqi soldiers. Saddam's Fedayeen fought especially hard here. Above the city of Al-Qut, AH-64 Apache helicopters were sent to suppress Iraqi artillery and armored units. But the mission ran into unexpectedly strong anti-air defenses, and several helicopters were damaged. One of the key ground battles took place near Najaf. That's where the Medina Division of the Republican Guard was concentrated, one of Iraq's most elite units. But US air power, supported by armored units, crushed them. The division was broken, and the road to Baghdad lay wide open. On April 9, 2003, American forces entered the Iraqi capital. In front of the world's cameras, a statue of Saddam Hussein was pulled down in the center of Baghdad, symbolizing the collapse of his regime. There was little organized resistance in the city. Commanders fled, soldiers surrendered or disappeared, and civilians watched the invaders arrive with silence or cautious hope. Paradoxically, many Iraqi divisions never even saw combat. Expecting attacks from the north or east, they stayed in positions that were never engaged. For them, the war ended before it began. The southern offensive was fast and effective. Iraq collapsed in a matter of weeks. Operation Iraqi Freedom was officially declared over on May 1, 2003, when President George Bush gave a speech aboard the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln under the now famous banner, "Mission accomplished." But in reality, fighting on the ground was far from over. After the fall of Baghdad, American forces continued to seize major Iraqi cities, Tikrit, Kirkuk, Mosul, and others. The last major stronghold of resistance was Tikrit, Saddam Hussein's hometown. On April 14th, it was taken without serious fighting. The Iraqi army, as a unified force, had effectively ceased to exist. Many soldiers simply took off their uniforms and vanished. But Saddam was still at large. A manhunt began. Operation Red Dawn. On December 13, 2003, American troops, including the 4th Infantry Division and Delta Force, found Saddam hiding on a farm near the town of Ad-Dawr. He was discovered inside an underground hideout, known as the Spider Hole. The arrest was made without resistance. Saddam was thin, bearded, and looked nothing like the dictator the world remembered. In the following years, he was held in American custody. He was tried by an Iraqi court under the supervision of coalition forces. The main charge, the killing of 148 Shiites in the town of Dujail in 1982. The trial lasted more than a year. During the hearings, Saddam repeatedly interrupted the judges and declared himself the legitimate president of Iraq. On November 5, 2006, he was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. The sentence was carried out on December 30, 2006, just before the Muslim holiday of Eid al-Adha. The execution was filmed, and the video leaked online, sparking mixed reactions around the world, from celebration to outrage. This was the end of Ba'athist Iraq, but not the end of the war. The years 2003 to 2011 marked a new kind of war, not fought through regular battles, but through guerrilla attacks, bombings, sectarian violence, and power struggles between rival groups. Instead of peaceful reconstruction, Iraq descended into chaos. The disbanding of the Iraqi army and security services, carried out by the American Occupation Administration, left hundreds of thousands of trained men without jobs, but with combat experience. Many of them joined insurgent movements, while others were absorbed by Islamist groups. By 2004, the U.S. was already facing armed uprisings, from the Shiite Mahdi army and from Sunni extremists. These forces would later lay the groundwork for the rise of ISIS. Iraq became a battlefield with no end. Cities like Fallujah, Baghdad, Samarra, and Ramadi turned into war zones that frequently changed hands. Kidnappings, ethnic cleansings, mosque bombings, and marketplace explosions became everyday events. Daily violence became the new normal. For the American public, the war in Iraq became a bitter disappointment. At first, most supported the invasion, seeing it as part of the wider war on terror. But as years passed and no nuclear weapons were ever found, trust in the government collapsed. The war became a symbol of deception, unnecessary sacrifice, and geopolitical overreach. Many veterans returned home with PTSD, missing limbs, and no clear understanding of what they had fought for. America's global reputation also took a heavy blow. For much of the global South, and for countries critical of the West, the Iraq War was proof of U.S. hypocrisy, double standards, and blatant violations of national sovereignty. Even among U.S. allies, frustration grew. The war deepened the divide between the West and the Muslim world. and the horrifying images of torture at Abu Ghraib prison only intensified the crisis of trust. Instead of a stable state, the ruins of Iraq became a power vacuum, one that would soon be filled by radical movements. And while American troops formally withdrew from Iraq in 2011, the real war, with new enemies and new tactics, was just beginning. The military actions against Iraq from 1991 to 2003 were not without justification. The Ba'athist regime wasn't just authoritarian. It launched 2 wars against its neighbors, used chemical weapons to destroy Kurdish towns, crushed Shiite uprisings with mass killings, and openly violated international norms. After the war with Iran and the occupation of Kuwait, it became clear: Iraq would not stop unless stopped by force. Whether Iraq had nuclear weapons in 2003 remains a subject of debate. Some believe the weapons were destroyed before the invasion. Others claim they were smuggled into neighboring countries. But one fact is certain: Iraq did possess chemical weapons, and had already used them, both against Iranians and its own people. Had those weapons ever fallen into the hands of terrorists or been used against Israel, the human cost could have been catastrophic. Tens of thousands of lives. The world wars of the 20th century taught us a painful but vital lesson. Aggressive regimes with imperial ambitions must be stopped early, before they can fully unfold. And the Ba'athist regime in Iraq was exactly that kind of threat. However, this war also revealed how easily overwhelming military power can lead to strategic failure. An unprepared occupation, disregard for local complexities, and a lack of a clear reconstruction plan. All of it led to chaos, a rise in extremism, and a deep loss of trust in the West. Victory on the battlefield doesn't always translate to victory in the hearts and minds of the people. One day, historians may call the Iraq War a necessary one. But even necessary wars require wisdom, foresight, and a sober understanding that defeating an enemy is not the same as building peace.